The whispers followed her everywhere. "Don't get too close," mothers would warn their daughters. "Bad luck clings to her like mountain fog." Rebecca Harlow kept her eyes forward, her spine straight as steel as she walked through Pinewood's dusty main street. The weight of 100 stairs pressed against her back, heavier than any physical burden she'd ever carried. But it was the weight of what they didn't know, couldn't know, that truly mattered. Because while they saw only a widow with suspicious circumstances, she carried generations of healing wisdom that could save their dying town. If only someone would listen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colorado Territory, 1878. Winter's grip had finally loosened its hold on Pinewood Valley, leaving behind mud-slicked paths and the promise of spring renewal. The mountain settlement had sprouted like a determined weed in the shadow of the Rockies, built not on dreams, but on the cold reality of silver veins running through the mountainside. Men came for fortune, families followed for necessity, and necessity had a way of hardening even the gentlest souls. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of amber and rose. Rebecca Harlow had been awake for hours already, tending to her small herb garden that clung to the south-facing wall of her cabin. The plot was barely 4 feet wide, but in it grew treasures more valuable than any ore the miners pulled from the mountain's belly. Feverfew for headaches, valerian for sleep, yarrow for wounds that wouldn't heal. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper on the morning breeze. "Plants speak if you listen close enough, Rebecca. They tell you what ails and what heals. Most folks have forgotten how to hear them." Most mornings, Rebecca found peace in these, early hours before the town awoke and remembered to shun her. Today, however, the distant sound of coughing carried from the cluster of miners' cabins. The sound was distinctive, deep, rattling, desperate. Another case of what the town had taken to calling the tunnel sickness. Rebecca straightened, brushing soil from her apron. The mining company Dr. Matthew Hayes insisted it was simply lung irritation from the dust. A hazard of the profession, he claimed. Nothing to be done except rest when it got bad. But Rebecca recognized something more sinister in that cough. It carried the same hollow tone she'd heard in the Appalachian coal country as a girl, when miners disturbed certain veins of rock that should have been left untouched. Dr. Hayes was a good man in many ways, educated at Philadelphia Medical College, dedicated to his patients. But he was also a man bound by the limitations of formal training, unable to see wisdom in what he considered primitive folk methods. And he was the mining company's man. First and foremost, the morning ritual of avoidance would begin soon. Rebecca gathered her basket of freshly cut herbs and headed inside. Her cabin stood apart from the others, at the eastern edge of town, where the forest began its climb up the mountainside. The isolation hadn't been her choice initially. It was the only place offered to her after Thomas died. Now she appreciated the buffer of distance and the proximity to the wilderness that provided her remedies. The cabin's interior was neat but sparse. A single room served as kitchen, bedroom, and apothecary all at once. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters, filling the air with a complex herbal fragrance that visitors, on the rare occasion she had any, often commented on with wrinkled noses. A bookshelf held her most precious possessions, her grandmother's journals, 5 generations of healing knowledge carefully documented by the women in her family. Rebecca set water to boil and began preparing a tincture of thyme and wild cherry bark. It wouldn't cure what ailed the miners, but it might ease their breathing until a true solution could be found. If anyone would accept her help, that is. The sun had fully risen by the time she finished filling a dozen small bottles. Rebecca secured them in her basket, covered with a clean cloth, and prepared herself for the weekly trip into town for necessities. These excursions were exercises in endurance, holding her head high while tolerating the stares, the sudden silence when she entered a shop, the way conversations shifted to whispers in her presence. Thomas Harlow had been found dead at the bottom of the Western mine shaft 2 years prior. The official ruling was accident, a misstep in the darkness, a fall no man could survive. But Pinewood needed something more satisfying than mere tragic chance. They needed someone to blame. Thomas had been well liked, a foreman with prospects. Their marriage had been brief, only 6 months, and childless. These facts alone would have been enough to raise eyebrows. But Rebecca's knowledge of herbs and reluctance to attend church regularly transformed suspicion into certainty for many. Not witchcraft exactly. Pinewood considered itself too modern for such superstitions, but something adjacent to it. A woman who knew too much, who kept to herself, who might have driven a good man to distraction or worse. Damaged goods, Martha. Winters had whispered to her friend at the general store, unaware that Rebecca could hear from the next aisle. Poor Thomas never knew what he was getting. Rebecca had learned to steel herself against such barbs. Today would be no different as she secured her shawl and stepped out into the spring morning. The main street of Pinewood bustled with morning activity. Wagons delivered supplies to the general store, miners heading to the day shift trudged up the mountain path, and women hurried about their errands. Rebecca noted how the activity near her shifted and stuttered. Conversations pausing, paths adjusting to maintain distance, as if misfortune might be contagious. Harrison's general store stood at the center of town, its wide porch serving as Pinewood's unofficial meeting place. Rebecca approached, noting the group of men gathered there, their discussion animated until they noticed her. Like a wave receding, their voices ebbed. Among them stood Dr. Hayes, his medical bag at his feet, hat tipped back revealing a furrowed brow. Dark circles beneath his eyes testified to sleepless nights, tending the growing number of sick miners. Their gazes met briefly, his weary, hers concerned before he looked away. Rebecca climbed the steps, keeping her focus ahead. Inside, Mrs. Harrison straightened from arranging a display of canned goods. Mrs. Harlow, she acknowledged with the bare minimum of courtesy. "What will you be needing today?" "Sugar, coffee, cornmeal, and 3 yards of muslin, please," Rebecca replied, her voice even. As Mrs. Harrison gathered the items, Rebecca noted the store had received a new shipment of medicines, glass bottles of patent remedies with colorful labels promising relief from everything from female complaints to baldness. Snake oil, her grandmother would have called them, designed to lighten purses rather than ease suffering. The door opened, bringing with it a shaft of sunlight and a figure that caused the already quiet store to fall into deeper silence. Nathaniel. Sullivan rarely came to town, and never without drawing attention. The former Army scout had arrived in Pinewood a decade ago, purchased land far up the northern ridge, and seemingly preferred the company of mountains to men ever since. Sullivan's appearance was as rugged as the terrain he inhabited, tall and lean, weathered by years under open skies, with eyes the pale gray of winter ice. He acknowledged no one as he moved through the store with purpose, gathering only the essentials: ammunition, coffee, flour, salt. Rebecca continued examining the new medicines, aware of Sullivan's presence but not particularly concerned by it. Unlike others in town, he had never shown her any particular disdain. Then again, he showed no one much of anything. The unexpected happened when Sullivan approached the counter where Rebecca waited for her items. He stood at a respectful distance, hat in hand, and nodded once in greeting, a simple gesture that nonetheless caused Mrs. Harrison's eyebrows to rise dramatically. The door burst open again, this time revealing Jacob Turner, one of the younger miners, his face streaked with dirt and panic. "Doc Hayes!" he called, before spotting the physician through the window on the porch. "It's Martin and Frank. They've collapsed in the western tunnel. Can't hardly breathe." The gathered men outside mobilized instantly, Dr. Hayes grabbing a bag and rushing toward the mine. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the spring air. 2 more cases, both in the western tunnel. The connection was undeniable to her, if to no one else. "Terrible business," Mrs. Harrison muttered, watching through the window as men rushed up the path toward the mine entrance. "3rd case this week." "5th," Sullivan corrected quietly, speaking for the first time. His voice was rough from disuse. "Peterson and Daniels 2 days ago." Mrs. Harrison clucked her tongue. "Mine dust is particularly bad this season with the new drilling. At least that's what Dr. Hayes says." Rebecca couldn't contain herself. "It's not the dust." Both Mrs. Harrison and Sullivan turned to her, the former with obvious disapproval, the latter with subtle interest. "I suppose you know better than our doctor?" Mrs. Harrison asked, voice sharp with sarcasm. Rebecca hesitated. Experience had taught her the futility of offering unwelcome observations, yet men were dying. "The sickness only comes from the western tunnel. If it were general mine dust, cases would appear throughout the operation." Mrs. Harrison's lips thinned to a hard line. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." "I'm sure Dr. Hayes has considered that, Mrs. Harlow. He's educated after all." The implication hung heavy, unlike you with your herbs and folk remedies. Rebecca accepted her purchases with a tight smile and turned to leave. To her surprise, Sullivan stepped aside, holding the door for her, a common courtesy rarely extended to her these days. Outside, Rebecca paused on the porch, watching the commotion up at the mine entrance. The basket of tinctures weighed heavy on her arm. Those little bottles might help ease the symptoms, but they wouldn't address the cause. For that, someone would need to listen. "You've seen this before." The words, spoken low beside her, startled Rebecca. Nathaniel Sullivan had followed her, out his own purchases tucked under one arm. His statement wasn't a question. Rebecca studied him cautiously. "Yes?" "Where?" "Coal country in the Appalachians. My father was a miner before." She hesitated, unwilling to share too much of her past. "Before we moved west." Sullivan nodded once, as if confirming something to himself. "Black rock with yellow streaks in. The western tunnel started appearing about a month ago when they broke into a new section." Rebecca's attention sharpened. "You've seen inside the mine?" "Helped shore up some supports last month. Mining company was short-handed." He shifted the package under his arm. "Men started getting sick a week after they hit that new vein." "Did you tell Dr. Hayes about the rock?" Sullivan's expression remained impassive. "Doctor doesn't put much stock in what an old scout notices." The parallel to her own situation wasn't lost on Rebecca. Different kinds of knowledge, equally dismissed. "It's arsenoperite," she said, testing whether he would scoff like the others. "When disturbed, it releases a poison into the air. Not contagious, but deadly all the same if exposure continues." Sullivan considered this, then simply asked, "Can it be managed?" The lack of disbelief was so unexpected that Rebecca almost didn't answer. "Yes, proper ventilation, wet cloths over faces while working near it. And those affected need specific treatments, not just rest and hope." A commotion from up the hill interrupted them. 2 miners emerged from the tunnel entrance, carrying an unconscious man between them. Even from this distance, Rebecca could see the bluish tinge to the man's lips. Dr. Hayes followed, directing them toward the company office that doubled as an infirmary during emergencies. Sullivan watched the procession with a grim expression. "Company won't close the tunnel. Western vein's the richest they've hit in years. They wouldn't need to close it permanently." Rebecca replied. "Just long enough to implement proper precautions." Their unlikely conversation was drawing attention. Several women passing by slowed, exchanging meaningful glances at the sight of the widow Harlow in conversation with the recluse Sullivan. Two outsiders finding common ground. Sullivan noticed as well. With a slight tip of his hat, he concluded, "Might be time someone listened to different kinds of knowing." Then he was gone, striding purposefully toward his horse, tethered at the end of the street. Rebecca watched him go, a strange feeling settling in her chest. For the first time in 2 years, someone in Pinewood had spoken to her as a person with valuable knowledge rather than a suspicious widow to be tolerated. The sensation was so foreign, she hardly recognized it. Respect. The moment passed quickly as reality reasserted itself. A man was fighting for his life up at the mine office. More would follow if the true cause remained unaddressed. Rebecca gripped her basket of tinctures and made a decision. The path to the mine office was steep, and Rebecca felt the weight of stairs as she climbed it with determination. Women whispered behind their hands. Men frowned at her audacity. She kept her eyes forward, just as she did every day walking through town, but this time with purpose driving each step. Outside the office, miners gathered in worried clusters. Through the window, Rebecca could see Dr. Hayes bent over the unconscious man, applying a mustard plaster to his chest. Standard treatment for respiratory distress, but woefully inadequate for arsenic poisoning. Jacob Turner, the young miner who had raised the alarm, noticed her approach. His expression wavered between hope and uncertainty. "Mrs. Harlow, what brings you up here?" Rebecca held out her basket, removing the covering cloth. "I've prepared something that might help with the breathing difficulties. It won't cure what's causing this, but it could provide some relief." Jacob glanced toward the office door, then back at Rebecca. His friend's labored breathing could be heard even outside. "Doc's doing what he can, but..." He swallowed hard. "Martin's not improving." The door opened and Dr. Hayes emerged, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. His face bore the strain of a man fighting a losing battle. When he spotted Rebecca, confusion replaced exhaustion. "Mrs. Harlow, this isn't a suitable place for..." "I've brought tinctures that might help with the respiratory symptoms," Rebecca interrupted, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Wild cherry bark and thyme, primarily. It won't address the underlying cause, but it could ease their suffering while you determine a more permanent solution." Dr. Hayes stared at Rebecca's offering, professional dignity warring with desperate necessity on his face. The ragged breathing from inside the office punctuated the tense silence between them. "Mrs. Harlow," he began, lowering his voice, "I appreciate the gesture, but I cannot endorse untested remedies. These men need proper medical treatment." Rebecca held her ground. "With respect, doctor, what they have now isn't working. This isn't some patent medicine with secret ingredients. It's wild cherry bark, known to calm respiratory spasms, and thyme, which helps clear the lungs." She hesitated before adding, "My grandmother treated miners with similar symptoms back east. Some of her methods are documented in medical texts, if that eases your mind." Dr. Hayes's shoulders sagged slightly, the weight of his unsuccessful treatments evident in his posture. Behind him, Martin's coughing grew more violent. Jacob stepped forward. "Doc, Martin's my closest friend. If there's something that might help..." The young miner's pleading gaze shifted between the doctor and Rebecca. Another miner called from inside. "He's turning bluer, Doc." That decided it. Dr. Hayes reached for one of Rebecca's bottles. "I cannot officially sanction this, but..." He didn't finish the sentence before hurrying back inside, tincture in hand. Rebecca exhaled slowly, aware of the curious and suspicious gazes of the gathered miners. She had crossed a boundary, inserting herself into what most considered the doctor's domain. There would be consequences, but they mattered less than the lives at stake. Jacob lingered, shuffling his feet anxiously. Mrs. Harlow, I should tell. I work the Western Tunnel too. Been having some trouble breathing lately, especially in the mornings. Rebecca studied his face, noting the slight pallor beneath his sun-weathered skin. How long? About a week. Nothing as bad as Martin yet, but he touched his chest unconsciously. Something's not right. Have you seen the black rock with yellow streaks? Rebecca asked quietly. Jacob's eyes widened in surprise. How did you know about that? We hit a new vein of it last month. Foreman's been pushing us to work that section hard. Says it's where the richest silver is running. The rock itself is dangerous when disturbed, Rebecca explained. It releases a poison into the air, like fire damp in coal mines, Jacob asked, demonstrating the practical knowledge miners passed amongst themselves. Similar, but this doesn't explode. It's more insidious. It builds up in the body over time. The door opened again, and Dr. Hayes reappeared. His expression had shifted from skepticism to cautious surprise. The tincture appears to be helping with the acute symptoms. His breathing has eased somewhat. He fixed Rebecca with an evaluating gaze. What exactly is in it? Rebecca sensed an opportunity and seized it. I'd be happy to explain the ingredients and preparation, but there's something more important you should know about the cause of these symptoms. Dr. Hayes glanced around at the listening miners, professional pride making him hesitate. Perhaps we should continue this discussion inside. Once, in the small infirmary, Rebecca observed 3 sick miners on makeshift cots. Martin's color had indeed improved slightly, though his breathing remained labored. The other 2 men appeared to be in earlier stages of the illness, but heading toward the same dire condition. You believe you know what's causing this? Dr. Hayes asked, keeping his voice professional but unable to hide his skepticism. Cyanopyrite, Rebecca stated firmly, a mineral that releases arsenic when exposed to air and moisture. The symptoms match arsenic poisoning exactly. The progressive weakness, the characteristic cough, the bluish discoloration. And Jacob just confirmed they're working a new vein containing black rock with yellow streaks, which is precisely how arsenopyrite appears. Dr. Hayes frowned. Arsenic poisoning? That's a serious accusation. The mining company has safety protocols. For dangers, they recognize, Rebecca countered. This isn't common knowledge, even among physicians. My grandmother documented cases in Appalachian mines. The progression is unmistakable. The doctor's scientific training warred with his corporate loyalty. If you're suggesting the mining company is knowingly exposing workers to poison, I'm suggesting no one realized what they were dealing with, Rebecca interrupted. But now that we do, action must be taken before more men fall ill. Dr. Hayes studied the sick miners, his medical training evidently pushing him toward considering her theory. Even if you're correct, and I'm not saying you are, what do you propose? The company won't shut down their richest vein. They wouldn't need to permanently. Proper ventilation would help significantly. Having the men wear damp cloths over their faces while working near the arsenopyrite, limiting exposure time. Rebecca paused. And those already affected need specific treatment beyond what's in those tinctures. A knock at the door interrupted them. Jacob entered, accompanied by Edward Blackwood, the mine owner's representative. Blackwood was a tall, imposing man whose fashionable Eastern suit seemed out of place in the rustic mining office. Dr. Hayes, Blackwood began without preamble. I'm told production has stopped in the Western Tunnel again because of these incidents. When can we expect these men back to work? His gaze fell on Rebecca, and his expression hardened. Mrs. Harlow, I wasn't aware you were now part of the medical staff. The condescension in his tone made Rebecca's spine stiffen, but she remained silent, recognizing that her position here was precarious at best. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat. Mr. Blackwood, I'm afraid these men won't be returning to work soon. Their condition is quite serious. Surely a few days' rest won't be sufficient, Dr. Hayes interrupted, with a firmness that surprised Rebecca. In fact, Mrs. Harlow has proposed a theory about the cause that I believe warrants investigation. Blackwood's expression darkened. Further, has she indeed? And what medical school granted Mrs. Harlow her qualifications? The same that taught me to recognize when traditional approaches are failing, Dr. Hayes replied, his professional dignity apparently overriding his earlier skepticism. Mrs. Harlow suggests the new rock vein in the western tunnel may be releasing a form of arsenic. The symptoms are consistent with such poisoning. Blackwood scoffed. Preposterous. We've had geologists examine every inch of that mountain. For silver content, Rebecca pointed out quietly. Not for potential hazards. Blackwood turned to her, eyes cold. Mrs. Harlow, your reputation for unconventional ideas precedes you. However, I suggest you leave mining matters to those who understand them. Dr. Hayes surprised her again. The Western Medical Journal published a study last year on mineral toxicity in Pennsylvania mines. I'd be negligent not to consider all possibilities given the clustering of cases in one specific tunnel. Rebecca felt a surge of gratitude toward the doctor. Whatever his private opinions of her methods, his commitment to his patients was evidently genuine. Blackwood's jaw tightened. Very well. Conduct whatever tests you deem necessary, but I expect a full report by week's end. The company cannot sustain continued disruption to our most profitable section. He turned to leave, adding over his shoulder, and Dr. Hayes, in the future, please consult with qualified personnel only. After he departed, an uncomfortable silence filled the room. Rebecca busied herself checking on Martin, whose breathing had improved but remained labored. He's right about one thing, Dr. Hayes finally said. I have no way to test for arsenic poisoning here. The nearest facility with such capabilities is in Denver, and samples would take weeks to process. There are simpler tests, Rebecca offered. Not as precise as laboratory analysis, but adequate for confirmation. Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Such as? Garlic. When heated with suspected arseniporite, it produces a distinctive odor. My grandmother documented the procedure. She hesitated. And there are treatments beyond what conventional medicine typically employs, methods to help the body eliminate the poison faster. The doctor's scientific skepticism returned. Mrs. Harlow, while I appreciate your input regarding the potential cause, I must draw the line at experimental treatments. They're not experimental, Rebecca countered. They're documented across generations of practice. Different from your training, yes, but proven effective nonetheless. Their discussion was interrupted by commotion outside. The door burst open to reveal Thomas Quinn, the mine foreman, his face flushed with anger. Hayes! What's this about closing the western tunnel? Blackwood just stormed by saying you're claiming it's poisoned. Dr. Hayes straightened. I've made no final determination, Tom, but we have multiple men seriously ill, all working the same section. Quinn's gaze shifted to Rebecca, and his expression darkened further. And you're taking medical advice from her now? The widow Harlow? He spat the words like they tasted foul. Half the town thinks she had something to do with her husband's accident, and now you're letting her interfere with mining operations. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and explicit in a way the usual whispers were not. Rebecca felt the familiar cold weight settle in her stomach, but kept her expression neutral. Dr. Hayes, to his credit, stood his ground. That's uncalled. For Quinn, Mrs. Harlow has offered a medical theory that happens to align with the evidence. As the company physician, I'm obligated to investigate all potential causes. Quinn jabbed a finger toward Rebecca. She's never set foot in that mine. What would she know about it? Black rock with yellow streaks in the western tunnel, Rebecca stated calmly. Started appearing about a month ago when you broke into a new section. The first man fell ill a week later. Now you have 5 cases, all from the same crew. Quinn's surprise at her specific knowledge was quickly masked by deepening suspicion. Been spying on our operation, have you? She knows, because it's happened before, came a new voice from the doorway. Nathaniel Sullivan stood there, filling the frame with his tall figure. The room fell silent at his unexpected appearance. Quinn recovered first. Sullivan? What business do you have here? Brought supplies, Sullivan replied simply, setting down a package wrapped in oilcloth. Charcoal for the poisoned men. Dr. Hayes looked bewildered. Charcoal? Binds to poison in the gut, Sullivan explained, his economical words directed at the doctor rather than Quinn. Army used it for bad water, food poisoning. Works for other toxins too. Rebecca nodded. He's right. Activated charcoal is used. In many poisoning cases, it won't help what's already absorbed into the body, but it can prevent further absorption. Quinn looked between them, incredulity giving way to anger. So the hermit and the widow are in league now, conspiring to shut down my operation. Sullivan's weathered face remained impassive. Not conspirators, observers. Seen this before in Montana Territory. Miners working a certain kind of rock. Same symptoms. 6 men dead before anyone listened. This revelation silenced Quinn momentarily. Dr. Hayes seized the opportunity to take control of the situation. Mr. Quinn, no one is shutting down operations permanently, but I am recommending temporary measures until we can determine whether there's a real danger. He gestured to the sick miners. These men deserve that much at least. Quinn's gaze drifted to his stricken employees, and a flicker of concern broke through his anger. Despite his hardened exterior, he wasn't indifferent to their suffering. What kind of measures? He asked gruffly. Improved ventilation, Dr. Hayes began, and wet cloths over faces near the suspect rock, Rebecca interjected. Limited shifts in that section. Regular health checks for the miners. Quinn scowled at her interruption, but addressed his question to Dr. Hayes. How long? A week to observe if new measures reduce incidents, the doctor replied. If they do, we'll have our answer, and the precautions can become standard procedure. The foreman considered this, clearly calculating lost production against the mounting problems of sick workers. Finally, he nodded curtly. 1 week, but I want daily reports, and if there's no improvement, we return to normal operations. After Quinn departed, Dr. Hayes turned to Sullivan. You've witnessed this condition before? Montana, 68, Silver, mine near Helena. Sullivan's manner of speech remained minimal but precise. Black rock with yellow streaks, men coughing, skin turning blue. Company called it mountain fever until too many died. What happened? Rebecca asked. Army captain, visiting his brother, recognized the symptoms. Had seen arsenic poisoning during the war. They closed the worst sections, improved airflow. Sullivan nodded toward the sick miners. Saved lives. Dr. Hayes absorbed this information with growing acceptance of Rebecca's theory. Mrs. Harlow, you mentioned tests and treatments. I'd like to hear more if you're willing to share your knowledge. The request, professional, respectful, was so unexpected that Rebecca momentarily struggled to respond. For 2 years, her expertise had been dismissed as superstition or worse. Now, in the span of a single morning, both Sullivan and Hayes were treating her as a valued source of information. I have my grandmother's journals at my cabin, she finally said. They detail both the garlic test for arsenic and treatments. For those affected, I'd like to review them, Hayes said. Perhaps this afternoon. Sullivan moved toward the door. I'll help Quinn set up better ventilation, worked silver mines after the war, know how air should flow. His offer was practical, matter of fact, without any grandstanding. Rebecca realized Sullivan was simply a man who solved problems directly, regardless of social complications. In Pinewood's world of whispers and judgments, his straightforward approach was almost revolutionary. As Sullivan departed, Dr. Hayes turned to continue treating his patients, applying the charcoal mixture to each man. Rebecca assisted wordlessly, guiding the doctor on proper application. They worked in surprisingly comfortable tandem, their shared goal transcending the awkwardness of their different backgrounds. "I owe you an apology, Mrs. Harlow," Hayes said quietly, as they finished with the third miner. "I've been dismissive of your knowledge because it didn't come through channels I recognized. That was unworthy of a physician whose primary duty is to his patients." Rebecca appreciated his honesty, but kept her focus practical. The important thing now is helping these men and preventing more cases. "My grandmother always said healing isn't about who's right, but about finding what works." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "A wise perspective, though I suspect finding what works often requires listening to voices outside the common chorus." He glanced. Toward the door Sullivan had exited. "Your defender is an interesting man. I don't believe I've exchanged more than 10 words with him in all his years here." "He's not my defender," Rebecca corrected. "He simply appears to value truth over social convenience. A rare quality in any community," Hayes observed, "though I imagine both of you have paid a price for it." The conversation was interrupted by Jacob, who rushed in with alarm evident on his face. "Doc! Another man's down in the auxiliary shaft." "Quinn sent me to fetch you." "The auxiliary shaft?" Hayes frowned. "Not the western tunnel?" "No, sir. It's connected, though. They share ventilation. Anderson was checking support beams and just collapsed." Rebecca and Hayes exchanged significant looks. If the poisonous air was spreading through connected passageways, the problem was potentially larger than they'd realized. "I'll gather my supplies," Hayes said, reaching for his bag. He hesitated, then turned to Rebecca. "Would you accompany me? Your expertise might prove valuable, especially if this confirms your theory about airborne spread." The invitation represented a seismic shift in her standing, from outcast to consultant in the space of a morning. Rebecca nodded, gathering the remaining tinctures. As they hurried toward the mine entrance, Rebecca was acutely aware of the stares following them. Word had already spread through Pinewood's efficient gossip network that the widow Harlow was somehow involved in the mining illness situation. Martha Winters and her sewing circle had positioned themselves strategically near the general store, ostensibly working on a quilt but clearly monitoring the day's unusual events. Martha made no attempt to lower her voice as they passed. First, she ensnares poor Thomas. Now she sunk her claws into Dr. Hayes. "And did you hear? That strange Sullivan man is involved too. 3 accidents in that mine since she arrived in Pinewood. Coincidence? I think not." Rebecca had long practice at appearing not to hear such comments, but Dr. Hayes lacked her experience. He stopped abruptly, turning to face the women. "Ladies, I would hope Christian charity might extend to not spreading falsehoods about a neighbor who is currently assisting with a medical emergency." His tone was polite, but carried unmistakable censure. "Mrs. Harlow's insights may well save lives today." Martha appeared momentarily flustered at being directly confronted, but recovered quickly. "We're merely concerned for the community's well-being, Doctor. Unusual associations raise questions." "Indeed they do," Hayes replied crisply. "I question why capable women would waste time on speculation when there are sick men who could benefit from actual assistance. Good day, ladies." He continued walking, leaving the sewing circle in stunned silence. Rebecca hurried to match his stride, surprisingly touched by the unexpected defense. "You didn't need to do that," she said quietly. I absolutely did, Hayes replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. Those women have been poisoning the community against you far more effectively than any mineral could. It's shameful. They reached the mine entrance, where a group of anxious miners stood waiting. Quinn emerged from the dark mouth of the tunnel, his face grim. Anderson's in bad shape. 2 men are bringing him out now. As if summoned by his words, figures appeared from the shadowy tunnel. 2 miners supporting a third whose limp form hung between them. Even in the dim light, Rebecca could see the telltale bluish tinge to Anderson's lips. Get him to the infirmary, Hayes directed. Mrs. Harlow, we'll need more of your tincture. Quinn's expression darkened at the continued inclusion of Rebecca, but he seemed less inclined to object, given the severity of the situation. Sullivan appeared from within the tunnel, his clothes dusty from examining the ventilation system. He approached their small group, addressing his comments primarily to Hayes. Airs move in wrong. Western tunnel pushes into auxiliary shaft, not the other way round. Anyone working connected sections is breathing the same poison. We need to close more than just the western tunnel then, Hayes concluded, at least until proper ventilation is established. Quinn's face flushed with anger. That's half our operation. Half your operation is contaminated, Sullivan stated bluntly. Choose between losing production or losing men. The stark choice hung in the air between them. Quinn's responsibility to the company warred visibly with his concern for his workers. Finally, he exhaled sharply. 2 days, I'll give you 2 days to prove this theory and implement solutions. After that, we resume normal operations, unless you can show me definitive evidence. It wasn't ideal, but it was progress. As Quinn stomped away to inform his workers of the temporary closure, Rebecca found herself standing between Sullivan and Hayes, an unlikely trio united by a common concern. We should perform the garlic test immediately, she suggested. If it confirms arseniparit, it might convince Quinn to extend the closure. Hayes nodded in agreement. I'll need to see to Anderson first, but afterward, yes. He glanced at Sullivan. Would you be willing to obtain samples from both tunnels? Your mining experience would ensure we get appropriate specimens. Sullivan inclined his head in silent assent, then turned to Rebecca. Your cabin after sundown. Bring your grandmother's journals. With that cryptic instruction, he headed back into the mine to collect the samples. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Rather presumptuous of him. Practical, Rebecca corrected. We need privacy to review the information without the entire town watching and jumping to new conclusions. Fair point, Hayes conceded. Shall I join you? As well, I'm most interested in these documented cases. Rebecca considered the implications. 2 men visiting her isolated cabin after dark would set the gossip mill churning at unprecedented speed. Yet the work was too important to be derailed by social considerations. Yes, she decided. Bring any medical texts you have on mineral toxicity. If we're to convince Quinn and Blackwood, we'll need to present a unified front with documentation they can't easily dismiss. As they walked back toward town, Rebecca was struck by how rapidly her circumstances had changed. This morning, she had been the shunned widow, tolerated, but never consulted. Now, she walked alongside the town physician as a respected colleague. The change was encouraging but precarious. Rebecca harbored no illusions about how quickly such acceptance could evaporate if their theories proved incorrect or if the mining company decided to sacrifice truth for profit. Still, for the first time in 2 years, she felt something like hope blossoming, not just for her standing in the community, but for her ability to put her knowledge to meaningful use. The afternoon would bring new challenges. For now, though, Rebecca allowed herself to experience the simple satisfaction of being heard. The last light of day painted long shadows across Rebecca's cabin as she arranged her grandmother's journals on the small table. Each leather-bound volume represented years of careful observation and hard-won knowledge, passed from mother to daughter for generations. Rebecca ran her fingers over the faded cover of the oldest journal, feeling the connection to women who had faced their own struggles in different times and places. A knock at the door pulled her from her reverie. Sullivan arrived first, punctual as sunset. He carried a small canvas sack, presumably containing the rock samples from the mine. His expression revealed nothing as Rebecca invited him inside, but she noticed his eyes scanning the room, taking in the bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, the neat arrangement of tincture bottles on the shelves, the absence of typical feminine touches that most Pinewood homes displayed. "Tea?" she offered, already heating water over the fire. Sullivan nodded once, setting his sack on the table with care. He removed his hat but remained standing, as if uncertain of the protocol for this unusual gathering. "Please, sit," Rebecca gestured to one of the 3 chairs she'd arranged around the table. "Dr. Hayes should arrive shortly." Sullivan settled into a chair, his large frame making the simple wooden furniture appear suddenly inadequate. His silence wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it felt like a natural extension of his character, a man who spoke only when necessary. "Have you worked many silver mines?" Rebecca asked, arranging cups for tea. 6, Sullivan replied. "Colorado, Montana, Nevada, Army before that." "What brought you to Pinewood?" A pause, as if weighing how much to share. "Quiet," he finally answered. "Fewer people." Rebecca nodded, understanding the appeal. "Yet, here you are, in the middle of town business." Something almost like amusement flickered across Sullivan's weathered features. "Seems that way." Another knock announced Dr. Hayes, who entered carrying his medical bag and several bound journals. His presence immediately changed the cabin's atmosphere, filling it with a nervous energy that contrasted with Sullivan's stillness. "Mrs. Harlow," Hayes greeted her, then nodded to Sullivan. "I apologize for my tardiness. Anderson took a turn for the worse, and I needed to stabilize him." "Will he recover?" Rebecca asked, pouring tea for the doctor. Hayes accepted the cup gratefully. "I believe so. Thanks in part to your tincture. His breathing has eased considerably." He placed his medical texts on the table. "I've brought what little information modern medicine offers on mineral poisoning. I'm eager to compare it with your grandmother's observations." Rebecca appreciated his professional tone. Unlike many educated men, Hayes seemed capable of acknowledging alternative sources of knowledge without condescension. "Let's examine the rock samples first," she suggested, gesturing to Sullivan's sack. "The garlic test should confirm our suspicions." Sullivan opened the sack, carefully extracting several rock specimens wrapped in cloth. He arranged them on the table. Black rock, streaked with yellowish veins, exactly as described. "Western tunnel," he indicated the largest specimen, then pointed to another. "Auxiliary shaft, connection point." Rebecca retrieved a small clay pot from her shelf, along with several cloves of garlic. The test is simple but effective. When arsenopyrite is heated with garlic, it produces a distinctive eliaceous odor, more pungent than ordinary cooked garlic. Dr. Hayes watched with scientific curiosity as Rebecca crushed the garlic, added water, and placed small fragments of the rock samples into the mixture. She set the pot at the edge of the fire, where it would heat gradually. "How long before we know?" Hayes asked. "Minutes only," Rebecca replied. "Meanwhile, let me show you my grandmother's documentation." She opened the journal, dated 1842-1847, turning to pages marked with a faded ribbon. "Here, Appalachian coal mines, similar symptoms. Note the blue tinge to extremities, the progressive weakness, the characteristic cough." Hayes leaned forward, studying the neat handwriting and detailed sketches of symptoms. His eyebrows rose appreciatively. "These are remarkably precise clinical observations. Your grandmother had a scientific mind. She did, Rebecca agreed, though she would never have used that term. To her, it was simply careful attention to what worked and what didn't. Sullivan, who had been silent during their exchange, suddenly straightened. "Smell it now." The sharp, distinctive odor rising from the pot confirmed their suspicions. It was garlic, but with an unmistakable metallic undertone that made it far more pungent than ordinary cooking. "Positive test," Rebecca confirmed. "The rock contains arsenopyrite." Hayes frowned, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "This is compelling evidence, but Blackwood and Quinn will demand more than a smell test." "The pattern of illness is equally telling," Rebecca pointed out. "Only men working near this rock have fallen ill, and all display identical symptoms that match documented cases of arsenic poisoning." Sullivan nodded. "Montana mine owner denied it too, until the third death." Hayes's expression grew troubled. "We can't wait for deaths to convince them." He turned to Rebecca's grandmother's journal again. "These treatments, do they work?" "They help the body eliminate the poison faster," Rebecca explained. "Fresh air, plenty of clean water, and specific herbs that support the organs most affected by arsenic: liver, kidneys, lungs. Plus better ventilation and protection while working," Sullivan added pragmatically. Hayes closed the journal, his decision made. "Tomorrow morning, I'll present our findings to Blackwood and Quinn. Sullivan, can you document the ventilation changes needed?" Sullivan nodded. "Already mapped it. Need more air shafts, canvas barriers to direct flow." "Good. Mrs. Harlow, would you prepare written instructions for both preventative measures and treatments? I'll incorporate them into my official recommendations." Rebecca felt a surge of purpose. "Of course, I'll have them ready by morning." Their discussion continued late into the evening, three different perspectives converging on a common goal. Hayes contributed medical terminology that would lend credibility to their report. Sullivan added practical mining knowledge about implementation. Rebecca provided the crucial understanding of arsenopyrite poisoning and its remedies. As they worked, Rebecca noticed subtle shifts in their interactions. Hayes no longer questioned her knowledge, but built upon it with his own. Sullivan's typically minimal responses gradually expanded as the technical aspects of mining ventilation required more detailed explanation. For Rebecca, the experience was transformative. After 2 years of isolation, she found herself engaged in meaningful work alongside respected allies. The widow Harlow, the hermit Sullivan, and the company doctor, an unlikely trio united by common purpose rather than social standing. When Hayes finally gathered his notes to leave, he paused at the door. "Mrs. Harlow, regardless of how Blackwood responds tomorrow, your contributions have been invaluable. I've learned more tonight about mineral toxicity than in all my medical training." The acknowledgement, simple but sincere, meant more than elaborate praise would have. "Thank you, Doctor. I hope tomorrow brings a favorable outcome." After Hayes departed, Sullivan remained, studying the map he'd drawn of the mine tunnels. Rebecca expected him to leave as well, but instead, he spoke without looking up. "They'll resist." Rebecca sighed, knowing he meant the mining company. "Yes, I expect they will. Not just the expense, the admission." Sullivan's economy of words didn't diminish his insight. Acknowledging the danger means acknowledging responsibility. "You think they'll reject our findings?" Sullivan finally looked up from his map. "Publicly, yes. Privately, they'll implement. Enough to keep men from dying, not enough to solve it completely." His assessment aligned with Rebecca's own concerns. "Then we'll need to be vigilant. Monitor the miners' health, track new cases." "Town needs what you know," Sullivan stated simply. Then, after a pause, "The rumors about your husband." The abrupt change of topic caught Rebecca off guard. "Thomas, Harlow's death had become so wrapped in whispers and speculation that sometimes she almost forgot the simple, painful truth of it. "What about them?" she asked carefully. Sullivan's direct gaze was neither accusatory nor pitying, simply attentive. "False?" "Yes," Rebecca answered, the single word carrying the weight of 2 years' silent endurance. "Thomas was a good man who died in an accident. Nothing more dramatic than that." Sullivan nodded once, accepting her word without question. Town needs reasons, stories, simpler than accepting that bad things happen without cause. His understanding of human nature, expressed so economically, struck Rebecca as profoundly accurate. People created narratives to explain tragedies, often at the expense of those already suffering. "Thank you," she said quietly. Sullivan looked momentarily confused. For what? For asking directly instead of assuming. For believing me without requiring proof. He shrugged slightly, as if such basic decency hardly warranted thanks. Truth matters more than comfortable stories. With that simple philosophy, Sullivan gathered his things and departed, leaving Rebecca to consider how such a straightforward approach to life had led both of them to the margins of Pinewood society. Morning brought clear skies and a sense of anticipation. Rebecca prepared the documents Hayes had requested, detailing treatments for those already affected and preventative measures for miners returning to work. She included sketches of the arsenopyrite rock to help workers identify dangerous areas, along with instructions for preparing protective face coverings. As she walked toward town for the meeting with Blackwood, Rebecca noticed something different in the atmosphere. Word of yesterday's events had spread, transforming her usual invisible passage into something remarked upon. Women still whispered, but some nodded in greeting. A miner touched his cap respectfully, murmuring that his brother was breathing. "Easier thanks to your medicine, Mom." Small gestures, yet they represented a shift in the community's perception. Contribution had begun to outweigh speculation, at least among those directly affected by the mine illness. The mining company office occupied the largest building in Pinewood, a 2-story structure with actual glass windows imported at great expense. Rebecca arrived to find Hayes and Sullivan already waiting outside. Hayes looked tired but determined, clutching a leather portfolio containing their findings. Sullivan stood slightly apart, his stance casual but alert. "Any change in the patients?" Rebecca asked Hayes quietly. "Improving steadily. The charcoal treatment and your tinctures have made a significant difference." Hayes lowered his voice further. "I've prepared myself for resistance. Blackwood answers to investors back east who won't welcome production delays." "We have facts on our side," Rebecca reminded him. Sullivan's brief comment was less optimistic. Facts against profit. Before Hayes could respond, the office door opened. Quinn appeared, his expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Blackwood will see you now." They entered a spacious office dominated by a large desk. Maps of the mine's tunnels covered one wall, while production charts occupied another. Edward Blackwood stood examining one such chart, his back to them as they entered. He turned unhurriedly, his Eastern suit as immaculate as if he were attending a Boston business meeting rather than overseeing a frontier mining operation. "Dr. Hayes," he acknowledged, then added with noticeable reluctance, "Mrs. Harlow, Mr. Sullivan." Hayes stepped forward, professional and direct. "Mr. Blackwood, we've completed our investigation into the illness affecting miners in the Western Tunnel. Our findings are conclusive and concerning." He proceeded to present their evidence: the pattern of illness, the arsenopyrite identification, the garlic test results, Sullivan's observations from the Montana incident, and Rebecca's documentation of similar cases in Appalachia. Throughout the presentation, Blackwood remained impassive, occasionally glancing at Quinn, who stood by the window with arms crossed defensively. When Hayes finished, Blackwood steepled his fingers. "This is all quite dramatic, Doctor. A hidden poison, secret folk remedies, conspiracy of silence in Montana. It sounds more like one of those sensational novels than a medical report." Hayes stiffened at the dismissive tone. "Sir, the evidence is scientific and substantial. Men are falling ill in a specific pattern that precisely matches arsenic poisoning, and we've identified the source." "Based on a garlic smell?" Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Hardly conclusive by any scientific standard I recognize." Rebecca stepped forward. "Mr. Blackwood, arsenic testing is limited even in sophisticated laboratories. The eliaceous odor test has been recognized since the time of Hippocrates as a reliable field indicator." Blackwood's gaze sharpened. "Mrs. Harlow, while your concern for our employees is touching, mining operations require decisions based on verifiable facts, not folklore." Sullivan, who had been silent until now, spoke with quiet authority. "Fact. 6 men died in Helena before owners acknowledged the same. Problem. Fact. Your men show identical symptoms. Fact. Simple precautions could prevent more cases." His intervention seemed to irritate Blackwood more than Hayes's medical arguments or Rebecca's knowledge had. "Mr. Sullivan, I wasn't aware you'd appointed yourself a mining safety expert. I understood you preferred isolation to community involvement." "Prefer truth to dead miners," Sullivan replied unflinchingly. Quinn shifted uncomfortably by the window. "Ed Anderson is pretty bad off. Martin too. Whatever's happening, it's serious." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Tom, need I remind you that production quotas affect everyone's compensation, including yours?" The implied threat hung in the air until Hayes broke the tension. "Mr. Blackwood, no one is suggesting permanent closure of the Western Tunnel. We're recommending improved ventilation, protective measures for workers, and treatment for those already affected." "At considerable expense and disruption," Blackwood countered. "At less expense than deaths would cause," Rebecca pointed out, "both in human terms and in potential liability." The mention of liability struck home. Blackwood's confident demeanor faltered momentarily. "What exactly do you mean by that, Mrs. Harlow?" "Simply that if men continue to fall ill after the company has been formally notified of the cause, legal questions might arise. I believe mining investors are particularly sensitive to such matters." It was a calculated risk, appealing to Blackwood's financial concerns rather than his humanity. Rebecca had limited knowledge of mining law, but her husband had mentioned enough about company liability to make her statement plausible. Blackwood considered her words, then abruptly changed tactics. "Dr. Hayes, I'll need time to review your findings in detail. In the meantime, what specifically are you proposing?" Hayes outlined their recommendations: additional ventilation shafts in the Western Tunnel, wet cloth masks for miners working near identified arsenopyrite veins, shorter shifts in affected areas, and continued treatment for those already ill. "And you believe these measures would allow work to continue safely?" "Yes, if properly implemented and monitored." Blackwood nodded slowly. "Very well. Quinn will implement the ventilation improvements and shorter shifts. The masks seem excessive, but I'll leave that to your medical judgment." He closed the portfolio with an air of finality. "I trust this resolves the matter." Rebecca recognized the political maneuver, appeared to concede while maintaining control of implementation. Without outside monitoring, the company could easily minimize the precautions once attention shifted elsewhere. "Dr. Hayes will need to conduct regular health examinations of the miners," she said firmly, "and continued access to those already under treatment." Blackwood's smile remained fixed. "Of course. That's his job, after all." He turned to Quinn. "Tom, please begin implementing these changes immediately. I'll expect the Western Tunnel operational again within 3 days." As they exited the office, Rebecca felt both victory and concern. They had secured official acknowledgement of the problem and authorization for countermeasures, but Blackwood's reluctance suggested ongoing vigilance would be necessary. "He agreed too easily," Sullivan murmured as they descended the office steps. Hayes nodded. "To the least expensive remedies. The ventilation improvements are necessary regardless of arsenopyrite. They improve productivity by clearing ordinary mine dust. We'll need to ensure the miners understand the importance of the face coverings," Rebecca added. "Blackwood may consider them excessive, but they're essential protection." Their discussion was interrupted by Jacob Turner, who approached with obvious excitement. "Is it true? Has the company agreed to fix the poison air?" News traveled quickly. In Pinewood, Hayes confirmed that ventilation improvements would begin immediately, along with other protective measures. Jacob's relief was palpable. "That's something, at least. Martin's looking better today. That medicine you gave him is working wonders, Mrs. Harlow." His genuine gratitude contrasted sharply with the suspicion she'd faced for so long. "I'm glad he's improving," Rebecca replied warmly. "Make sure he continues taking the tincture 3 times daily and drinks plenty of water to help flush the poison." As Jacob hurried off to share the news with other miners, Sullivan turned to Rebecca. "See the change? Yesterday they avoided you. Today they seek you out." Rebecca had indeed noticed the shift. "It's the treatment proving effective, not me personally." "The results matter more than stories," Sullivan observed, echoing their conversation from the previous night. "Truth outlasts rumors." Hayes cleared his throat. "Speaking of treatment, I should check on the patients. Mrs. Harlow, would you be willing to prepare more of your tinctures? We're likely to need them as additional early-stage cases emerge." His request, professional collegial, represented another step toward legitimizing her knowledge. "Of course. I'll bring them to the infirmary this afternoon." As Hayes departed, Sullivan remained studying Rebecca with his characteristically direct gaze. "You forced Blackwood's hand, the liability mention." Rebecca smiled slightly. "I suspected financial consequences would motivate him more than humanitarian concerns." "Smart," Sullivan acknowledged. "Might have made an enemy, though." "I suspect that ship sailed when I first suggested his profitable mine was poisoning workers," Rebecca replied dryly. A hint of amusement crossed Sullivan's usually impassive features. "True enough." He glanced toward the mine entrance visible on the hillside. "Need to check their ventilation work. Make sure it's done right." Rebecca appreciated his continued involvement. Without Sullivan's practical mining experience, the company might implement superficial changes that looked appropriate but achieved little. "Thank you," she said simply, "for supporting this cause when you could have remained uninvolved." Sullivan considered her words with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Isolation is a choice. Indifference isn't." With that philosophical distinction, he nodded farewell and headed toward the mine, leaving Rebecca to ponder how someone who valued solitude so highly could also possess such a clear moral compass regarding community welfare. The next several days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Rebecca divided her time between preparing remedies, assisting Hayes with patient care, and documenting new cases. The mining company implemented some of their recommendations, improving ventilation and shortening shifts, but resisted others, particularly the protective face coverings that miners found uncomfortable and cumbersome. Sullivan monitored the ventilation improvements, quietly correcting deficiencies when he found them. His presence at the mine gradually became accepted, even welcomed by workers who recognized his practical expertise. On the 4th day, Hayes arrived at Rebecca's cabin in the early evening looking troubled. "We have a problem," he announced without preamble. "Blackwood is declaring the situation resolved and ordering full production to resume tomorrow, including regular shift lengths." Rebecca set aside the tinctures she'd been preparing. Based on what evidence? No new severe cases in 3 days. Hayes replied, accepting the cup of tea she offered. Which is true, but misleading. The ventilation has helped, certainly. However, I've seen several miners with early symptoms who are hiding them for fear of losing wages. And the face coverings? Hayes sighed heavily. Abandoned almost entirely, Quinn considers them an unnecessary burden that slows production. Rebecca's concern deepened. The combination of longer exposure and no protection will lead to more serious cases, perhaps within days. I know, Hayes agreed grimly. I've expressed my objections, but Blackwood insists the crisis is over. He's even suggested your continued involvement is creating unnecessary anxiety among the workers. The implication was clear. Rebecca was being edged out now that the company had implemented the minimum acceptable changes. And what do you think, Doctor? She asked carefully. Hayes met her gaze directly. I think Blackwood is prioritizing production over safety, and I think your knowledge remains essential, but my position is complicated. Rebecca understood his predicament. As the company physician, Hayes's livelihood depended on maintaining a working relationship with Blackwood. What about Sullivan? She asked. Is his involvement also being discouraged? Not explicitly, Hayes replied. His mining expertise makes him harder to dismiss, but there's growing pressure to return to normal operations, which implicitly means less outside oversight. Rebecca considered their options. Direct confrontation with Blackwood would likely fail, possibly jeopardizing Hayes's position and the limited improvements already achieved. The miners themselves might be our best allies, she suggested. If they understand the ongoing risk and the importance of protection, they could insist on proper precautions. Hayes looked doubtful. Men worried about feeding their families rarely risk antagonizing their employers. Unless they recognize that their lives are at stake, Rebecca countered. Perhaps Sullivan could speak with them. They respect his practical knowledge. Their discussion was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sullivan himself entered, his expression more grave than usual. 2 new cases, he announced without greeting. Johnson and Pearson, working the western tunnel this morning without masks, found them struggling to breathe at shift end. Hayes stood immediately. How severe? Bad, not worst yet, but heading there. Rebecca was already gathering her supplies. Where are they now? Infirmary. Hayes's assistant is with them. Sullivan's gaze fixed on Hayes. Company's narrative is falling apart fast. Hayes rubbed his forehead wearily. Blackwood will claim they were already ill, that it's unrelated to today's work. Miners know better, Sullivan replied. Talk is spreading. Rebecca secured her basket of remedies. We should go to them immediately. These early hours of treatment are crucial. As they hurried toward town, the sunset painted the western sky in shades of red and gold that seemed ominous rather than beautiful. Rebecca noticed unusual activity in the town center. Clusters of miners engaged in animated conversation, their expressions worried and angry. Word travels fast, Hayes observed. Sullivan nodded. Miners protect their own. Company loyalty only extends so far. The infirmary was crowded when they arrived. Not only were Johnson and Pearson being treated, but several other miners had come seeking examination, suddenly willing to acknowledge symptoms they'd previously hidden. Hayes's young assistant, a medical student named William, looked overwhelmed. With relief at their arrival, Doctor, thank goodness. I've administered the mustard plasters as you taught me, but Mr. Johnson's breathing is particularly labored. Rebecca moved immediately to Johnson's bedside. The miner's lips had the telltale bluish tinge of advanced arsenic poisoning, and his breathing came in ragged gasps. She began preparing one of her stronger tinctures while Hayes conducted his examination. Definitely arsenopyrite poisoning, Hayes confirmed grimly. worse than Anderson's initial presentation. Outside, the murmur of voices grew louder. Through the window, Rebecca could see more miners gathering, some still in their work clothes, others who had come from home after hearing about the new cases. Sullivan stepped outside briefly, returning with a report. Miners are organizing. Talk of refusing to enter the Western Tunnel without better protection. Hayes looked torn between professional caution and moral obligation. If they strike, Blackwood could bring in replacement workers. Many here can't afford to lose their positions. They can't afford to die either, Rebecca pointed out, administering her tincture to Johnson. This case is progressing faster than in previous ones. The arsenic concentration in the Western Tunnel must be increasing as they dig deeper. Sullivan's expression darkened. Ventilation changes weren't maintained properly. Company got careless once pressure eased. Their discussion was interrupted by the infirmary door bursting open. Quinn stormed in, his face flushed with anger and exertion. "What the hell is happening?" he demanded. "Half my evening shift is standing outside instead of reporting for work." Hayes straightened, medical authority evident in his posture. "2 more serious cases of arsenopyrite poisoning, Tom. Both men working the Western Tunnel today without proper protection." Quinn's gaze shifted to the struggling miners, and his anger faltered visibly. Blackwood said the situation was under control. "It was improving," Rebecca corrected gently. "But the protective measures need to be maintained consistently, not abandoned once symptoms decrease." Sullivan stepped forward. Ventilation improvements were neglected. Air shafts not cleared properly, canvas barriers removed for efficiency. Quinn's expression shifted from anger to genuine concern. Unlike Blackwood, he worked alongside these men daily, knew their families, shared their dangers. "What needs to be done?" he asked finally. The simple question, pragmatic without defensiveness, marked a turning point. For the next hour, they outlined what proper ongoing protection would require: consistent ventilation maintenance, mandatory face coverings near arsenopyrite veins, regular rotation of miners to limit exposure, and immediate treatment for anyone showing symptoms. Quinn listened with growing resolution. Blackwood won't like it. Production targets will suffer. "Less than they would if miners refuse to work," Sullivan observed. "Or if more fall too ill to continue," Rebecca added. The foreman nodded slowly. "I'll speak with the men. If they understand the precautions will be real this time, not just for show, they might agree to continue working." As Quinn left to address the gathered miners, Hayes turned to Rebecca with cautious optimism. This could be a genuine victory if the company actually implements proper protection. "And maintains it," Sullivan added, his natural skepticism asserting itself. Rebecca watched through the window as Quinn spoke with the miners, his gestures indicating the seriousness of his commitment. The men listened intently, occasionally glancing toward the infirmary where their stricken colleagues fought for breath. "They'll continue working," she predicted, "but with awareness now. Knowledge has shifted the balance of power." Sullivan nodded his agreement. "Hard to unsee danger once it's pointed out. Harder still to ignore it." Their cautious optimism seemed validated when several miners entered the infirmary, requesting the protective masks they had previously discarded. Others volunteered to help monitor ventilation systems to ensure proper maintenance. By the time darkness fell completely, a new understanding had emerged. The miners would continue working, but with active participation in safety measures. Quinn had committed to enforcing precautions, seemingly recognizing that his own long-term interests aligned with the welfare of his men rather than with Blackwood's production quotas. As the crisis atmosphere gradually subsided, Rebecca found herself at an unexpected crossroads. For months she had lived in isolation, her knowledge valued by no one in Pinewood. Now miners sought her advice, brought their symptoms to her attention, asked questions about protecting their health. The shift was disorienting but profoundly gratifying. As she walked home through the darkness, Sullivan fell into step beside her, his silent presence somehow comforting in its constancy. "Things are changing," she observed quietly. Sullivan considered this with his usual thoughtfulness. "People are seeing you differently. They're seeing what I know, not necessarily who I am." "Beginning of recognition," Sullivan replied. "Rest follows if you're patient." Rebecca smiled at his economical wisdom. "Is that why you remained apart all these years, waiting for the town to recognize your value?" Sullivan's stride didn't falter, but something in his expression shifted, subtly. "Not waiting for anything, prefer solitude, simple. Yet here you are, deeply involved in town affairs." He glanced at her sideways, something almost like humor in his eyes. "Temporary lapse in judgment." Rebecca laughed softly, surprising herself with the unfamiliar sound. "Well, I'm grateful for your temporary madness, Mr. Sullivan." They walked in companionable silence until reaching her cabin. Sullivan paused at the edge of her small garden, looking toward the distant silhouette of the mine against the night sky. "Tomorrow will bring new challenges," he observed. "Blackwood won't surrender control easily." "No," Rebecca agreed. "But neither will the miners now that they understand the stakes, and neither will we." Sullivan nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both agreement and respect. "Rest well, Mrs. Harlow." As his tall figure disappeared into the darkness, Rebecca realized something had fundamentally shifted, not just in how the town viewed her, but in how she viewed herself. The widow Harlow, damaged goods, object of whispers and speculation, was giving way to a woman of knowledge and purpose, a healer whose worth was finally being recognized. Whatever tomorrow brought, Blackwood's resistance, new cases, ongoing struggles, she would face it not as an outcast, but as someone with allies, with purpose, and most importantly, with the quiet confidence that truth, eventually, outlasts. Rumors. Dawn broke over Pinewood with unusual activity for such an early hour. Miners gathered at the mouth of the tunnel, their faces resolute, as Quinn demonstrated the proper way to secure the damp cloth masks. Rebecca watched from a distance, not wanting to insert herself where she might not be welcome, but ready to assist if needed. The scene represented progress, miners taking active measures to protect themselves, the foreman enforcing safety rather than merely production quotas. "Quite a change from last week," Dr. Hayes observed, joining her at the edge of the clearing. "Quinn appears to have embraced his role as safety enforcer with unexpected enthusiasm." Rebecca nodded. "Near disasters often clarify priorities. He knows those men, sees them as people, not just labor." "Unlike Blackwood," Hayes added grimly. "Speaking of whom, he's requested a meeting this morning. Apparently news of last night's events reached him at his residence." Rebecca wasn't surprised. Blackwood maintained a comfortable home in the valley below Pinewood, removed from the dust and noise of the mining operation, but close enough to maintain control. "Will he attempt to reverse Quinn's safety measures?" she asked. Hayes frowned. "Possibly. Though with the miners now aware of the danger, such a move would risk more than just health concerns. Production would suffer if men refused to work unsafe sections." Their conversation was interrupted by Sullivan's approach. Unlike his usual solitary manner, he'd been actively engaged with the miners all morning, demonstrating ventilation improvements and inspecting the reinforced air shafts. "Ventilation improved," he reported concisely. "Maintained properly this time. Airflow doubled in Western Tunnel." "And the miners are using the protective masks?" Rebecca asked. Sullivan nodded. "Most. Some resistance from older men, pride, working on convincing them." It was the longest speech Rebecca had heard from the normally taciturn man. a sign of his investment in the outcome. Hayes seemed to note this as well, studying Sullivan with renewed interest. "You've become quite the advocate, Mr. Sullivan," the doctor observed. "For a man who values his solitude, you've thrown yourself fully into this community crisis." Sullivan shrugged slightly, apparently uncomfortable with the observation. "Temporary necessity. Well, your mining expertise has proven invaluable," Hayes continued. "The men respect your practical knowledge in a way they might not respect medical theory alone." Rebecca sensed Sullivan's growing discomfort with this praise and changed the subject. "When is your meeting with Blackwood?" 9 o'clock, Hayes replied, checking his pocket watch. "In approximately 30 minutes, I should prepare." "I'll come with you," Rebecca offered, anticipating his protest and adding quickly, "not to the meeting itself, but to be nearby if medical questions arise regarding treatment protocols." Hayes seemed relieved by this compromise. "That would be helpful, thank you. The more precise our medical response appears, the harder it will be for Blackwood to dismiss our concerns." Sullivan surprised them both by adding, "I'll continue here. Ensure ventilation maintenance, monitor miners for symptoms." His ongoing commitment to the cause, despite his clear preference for solitude, spoke volumes about his character. Rebecca felt a deepening respect for this complex man who spoke so little, yet acted so decisively. As she and Hayes walked toward town, Rebecca noticed subtle changes in how people acknowledged her. Mrs. Harrison, arranging produce outside the general store, offered a tentative good morning instead of her usual avoidance. A group of miners' wives didn't exactly greet her, but neither did they hurry their children away as she passed. "Your standing is improving," Hayes observed quietly. "Success has a way of changing public perception." "For now," Rebecca replied, realistic about the temporary nature of such changes. "A community's memory can be short, perhaps, but effectiveness is harder to dismiss than rumors. Your remedies are working, Mrs. Harlow. The evidence is visible to anyone who cares to see it." They reached the mining company office to find it already bustling with activity. Clerks hurried between rooms, carrying ledgers and documents, their expressions tense. Clearly, Blackwood was gathering ammunition for the coming confrontation. Hayes straightened his coat, adopting the professional demeanor that served him so well. "Wish me luck, Mrs. Harlow. I suspect I'll need it." "You have facts on your side, Doctor, and the miners as well." He nodded grimly. "Facts and workers rarely outweigh profit in these situations, but we shall see." As Hayes disappeared into Blackwood's office, Rebecca settled on a bench outside, arranging her notes on treatment protocols. She had brought her grandmother's journal as well, marked at passages describing similar cases and successful interventions. Being prepared mattered, even if Blackwood refused to acknowledge her presence or contribution. Through the window, she could see Hayes and Blackwood engaged in what appeared to be an increasingly heated discussion. The company man's face had flushed to an alarming shade of red, while Hayes maintained his professional composure, occasionally gesturing to the medical documents before him. Nearly an hour passed before the office door finally opened. Hayes emerged, looking weary but resolute, followed by a visibly frustrated Blackwood. "I maintain this is an overreaction, Doctor," Blackwood was saying. "These additional measures represent unnecessary expense and disruption." "The medical evidence suggests otherwise," Hayes replied evenly. "And I believe Mrs. Harlow's expertise regarding specific treatments would be valuable in minimizing recovery time." Blackwood noticed Rebecca for the first time, his expression souring further. "Mrs. Harlow appears to have inserted herself into company business quite thoroughly." Rebecca rose, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My only interest is in the miners' health, Mr. Blackwood. Their recovery benefits everyone, including your production quotas. Blackwood studied her with cold calculation. You've cultivated quite a following among my employees, it seems. Folk remedies and dramatic warnings about poison rock. Very theatrical. Effective, regardless of how you characterize it, Hayes interjected. The miners improving under her treatment protocols would likely use different terminology. A tense silence followed, broken by the arrival of Quinn. The foreman approached cautiously, clearly sensing the confrontational atmosphere. "Mr. Blackwood," he acknowledged. "Dr. Hayes, Mrs. Harlow." Blackwood turned his frustration toward the new arrival. "Quinn, I understand you've implemented unauthorized safety measures without consulting me." Quinn straightened, seemingly prepared for this accusation. "With respect, sir, I made operational adjustments to address an immediate health crisis affecting our workforce. Dr. Hayes confirmed the medical necessity. And these adjustments now include reduced shifts, mandatory masks, and regular health examinations." Blackwood's tone made the reasonable measures sound like radical impositions. "Yes, sir. All proven effective in similar mining operations facing arsenopyrite exposure," Quinn replied, surprising Rebecca with his informed response. He had clearly been studying the situation more thoroughly than she'd realized. Blackwood's expression tightened. "I see Dr. Hayes has converted you thoroughly to his cause." "No conversion needed, sir. I've watched 6 men collapse from working that western tunnel. That's evidence enough for me." The simple, straightforward response seemed to catch Blackwood off guard. He had expected excuses or defensive explanations, not this calm assertion of facts. "Very well," he finally said, visibly recalculating his strategy. "Maintain your precautions for now, but I expect detailed documentation of all expenses incurred and any production impacts." He turned to Hayes. "And I expect weekly reports demonstrating the medical necessity of continuing these measures." "Of course," Hayes agreed readily. "Thorough documentation benefits everyone." Blackwood's gaze shifted to Rebecca. "As for Mrs. Harlow's involvement, I remain skeptical. However, if her remedies are indeed effective, I won't interfere with treatment of those already ill." His emphasis on already made it clear he viewed her role as temporary and limited. Rebecca understood the implicit boundary being drawn, but chose not to challenge it directly. The miner's health mattered more than her recognized status. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I'll ensure Dr. Hayes has complete documentation of all treatments administered." With a curt nod, Blackwood retreated into his office, closing the door with deliberate firmness. Quinn exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "That went better than expected," he murmured. "Thought for sure he'd order a full return to normal operations." Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "He's balancing multiple concerns. Production matters, but so does the company's reputation. An outbreak of fatal poisoning would draw unwanted attention from investors and possibly authorities. And the miners themselves now understand the risk," Rebecca added. "Forcing them to work without protection could trigger resistance he can't afford." Quinn glanced at Rebecca with newfound respect. "Never thought I'd see the day when miners would take medical advice over company orders, but here we are." He paused, discomfort evident in his expression. "Mrs. Harlow, I owe you an apology. I was unfair in my assessment of your involvement." The unexpected acknowledgement caught Rebecca by surprise. "You were protecting your operation, Mr. Quinn. Under the circumstances, skepticism was natural." "Maybe so, but there's skepticism, and then there's prejudice." Quinn's honesty was refreshing. "Rumors are powerful things in a small town. Too often we let them do our thinking for us." The foreman's insight, simple but profound, struck Rebecca as particularly meaningful, coming from a man who had initially been among her harshest critics. Before she could respond, a commotion from the street caught their attention. Martha Winters was hurrying toward them, her usually composed face flushed with urgency. "Dr. Hayes, thank goodness you're here. It's my William. He's taken terribly ill. Breathing all wrong and his lips turned the strangest color." Hayes frowned in confusion. "William? But he doesn't work in the mines." "No, of course not. He's only 12, Martha replied impatiently. "But he's been helping his father in the assay office, crushing samples from the new western vein for testing." Rebecca and Hayes exchanged alarmed glances. Neither had considered the potential for arsenic exposure beyond the mine itself. "The assay office?" Rebecca said quietly. "Of course, they grind the ore samples to powder for testing, perfect conditions for releasing the arsenic into the air." Hayes was already gathering his bag. "Mrs. Winters, we'll come immediately. Mrs. Harlow, would you bring your remedies? If it's arsenopyrite poisoning, time is essential." Martha's expression shifted from relief to uncertainty as she registered Rebecca's inclusion. Well, Dr. Hayes, is that really necessary? Surely your medical training. Mrs. Harlow's treatments have proven highly effective for this specific condition." Hayes interrupted firmly. "If you want your son to receive the best possible care, her assistance is invaluable." The choice, prejudice versus her child's welfare, played visibly across Martha's face. Maternal concern ultimately won. "Very well. Please, both of you, come quickly." As they hurried toward the Winters' home, Quinn called after them. "I'll alert the assay office. Have them stop processing Western Tunnel samples immediately." The Winters' residence sat on what passed for Pinewood's affluent hill, a modestly larger home with actual flower beds framing the front porch. They found Thomas Winters pacing anxiously while young William lay on a sofa, his breathing labored and skin ashen except for the telltale bluish tinge around his lips. "Doctor, thank God," Thomas greeted them, barely acknowledging Rebecca's presence. He was fine yesterday, just a slight cough. This morning he could hardly stand. Hayes immediately began his examination, while Rebecca prepared a stronger version of her tincture, specially formulated for rapid administration in acute cases. "When did William begin working in the assay office?" Hayes asked, listening to the boy's chest with his stethoscope. "Last week," Thomas replied, watching anxiously. "Just sorting and labeling samples, nothing dangerous." "The samples themselves are the danger," Rebecca explained quietly, measuring herbs with practiced precision, "particularly those from the Western Tunnel containing arsenopyrite." Martha hovered nearby, torn between tradition-inspired distrust of Rebecca and desperate concern for her son. Is it the same illness affecting the miners?" "Yes," Hayes confirmed grimly. "Arsenic poisoning from the rock dust. His symptoms match exactly." Rebecca approached with her prepared remedy. "This will help ease his breathing and begin the process of clearing the poison." Martha hesitated only briefly before nodding permission, her son's distress overriding years of cultivated suspicion. As Rebecca administered the tincture, she provided calm, clear instructions. "He'll need this every 4 hours, along with as much clean water as he can drink. The charcoal mixture Dr. Hayes will prepare helps bind the poison still in his system." Thomas watched with poorly concealed skepticism. "And this herb concoction, it's proven effective? 6 miners have shown significant improvement under Mrs. Harlow's treatment protocols," Hayes replied, before Rebecca could. "Combined with proper medical monitoring, it's currently our most effective approach." William's breathing had already begun to ease slightly, the powerful herbs taking effect. Martha noticed the improvement, her expression shifting from doubt to cautious hope. "How long before he recovers?" she asked, addressing Rebecca directly for perhaps the first time in 2 years. "Each case varies," Rebecca answered honestly. "But with consistent treatment and no further exposure, He should show significant improvement within days. Complete recovery may take weeks, depending on the level of exposure. Hayes completed his examination and preparations, adding his own instructions to Rebecca's. "Mrs. Winters, I'll return this evening to check his progress. In the meantime, follow Mrs. Harlow's treatment schedule precisely. Fresh air is also beneficial, so keep windows open when weather permits." As they prepared to leave, Martha unexpectedly touched Rebecca's arm. "Mrs. Harlow, thank you for coming, for helping William." The simple acknowledgement, from a woman who had been among the most enthusiastic spreaders of rumors, represented another small shift in Pinewood's perception. Rebecca nodded in response, unwilling to embarrass Martha with excessive gratitude for what should have been basic human decency all along. Outside, Hayes sighed heavily. "The assay office. We should have anticipated that exposure point." "None of us considered it," Rebecca consoled him. "Now we must ensure anyone working with ore samples understands the risk and takes proper precautions." They walked briskly toward the assay office, where they found Quinn already implementing emergency measures. Workers were opening windows, donning makeshift masks, and carefully containing rock samples from the western tunnel. "Moved quickly once I explained," Quinn told them with evident satisfaction. "Nobody wants what happened to the miners or the—" "Winters, boy," Hayes surveyed the improved conditions with approval. "Excellent work, Quinn. We'll need to establish permanent protocols for handling these samples." "Already discussing that with Sullivan," Quinn replied. "He's designing a ventilated cabinet for grinding samples. Says they use something similar in Montana after their incident." Rebecca was impressed by the swift transition from denial to active problem-solving. Crisis had forced collaboration across Pinewood's usual social boundaries, creating unexpected partnerships and revealing capabilities previously ignored. As they left the assay office, Rebecca noticed Sullivan approaching from the direction of the mine. He acknowledged them with a brief nod. "Ventilation holding well," he reported. "Miners following protocols. No new symptoms reported." Hayes shared the news about young William and the assay office exposure. Sullivan listened intently, his expression growing more concerned. "Need to check for other exposure points," he said thoughtfully. "Crushing facility, storage areas." "Good thinking," Hayes agreed. "The risk might extend beyond what we've identified so far." Their impromptu meeting was interrupted by Edward Blackwood, who approached with long, purposeful strides, his expression thunderous. "Dr. Hayes," he began without preamble, "I understand you've diagnosed the Winters boy with the same condition affecting our miners." "Yes, arsenic poisoning from handling arsenopyrite samples in the assay office," Hayes confirmed. Blackwood's mouth tightened. "This development complicates matters considerably. The miners are employees who understand occupational risks. A child with the same symptoms creates unfortunate perceptions." His concern for perceptions, rather than the boy's health, revealed much about Blackwood's priorities. Rebecca felt a surge of disgust, but kept her expression neutral. "Perception isn't the issue," Sullivan stated bluntly. "Safety is. Need comprehensive approach. Identify all exposure points." Blackwood eyed Sullivan with thinly veiled irritation. "Mr. Sullivan, while your mining expertise is acknowledged, company operations extend beyond your purview." "Arsenic doesn't care about purview," Sullivan replied, unintimidated. "Kills, regardless." The simple truth hung in the air between them. Hayes diplomatically steered the conversation toward practical matters. "Mr. Blackwood, we're identifying all potential exposure points to prevent further cases. This protects both the community and the company's interests." "And Mrs. Harlow's remedies are apparently being distributed throughout town now," Blackwood observed with evident displeasure. "Creating quite the reputation for her, I understand." The implication was clear. He viewed Rebecca's growing acceptance as somehow threatening to established authority, including his own. Her treatments are effective, Hayes stated firmly. As a physician, I endorse their use for these specific symptoms. Lockwood studied them thoughtfully, visibly recalculating his approach. I see you've formed quite the coalition. Very well. Proceed with your safety measures and treatments. But understand this. The company expects operations to return to normal production levels within the week, with these new precautions incorporated efficiently. After he departed, Sullivan summed up the situation with characteristic brevity, adapting to reality, reluctantly. Indeed, Hayes agreed. He recognizes he can't fight this battle without significant consequences. Better to appear cooperative, while preserving as much production as possible. Rebecca appreciated their assessment, but remained focused on immediate needs. We should check other potential exposure points immediately, and I'll need to prepare more remedies, particularly if we identify additional cases. They divided responsibilities efficiently. Hayes would examine anyone working near or processing for early symptoms. Sullivan would inspect facilities for potential arsenopyrite exposure. Rebecca would prepare additional remedies and check on existing patients. As Rebecca walked toward her cabin to gather supplies, she noticed something unfamiliar. Mrs. Peterson, wife of one of the affected miners, walking purposefully toward her rather than away. Mrs. Harlow, the woman called, slightly breathless from hurrying. Might I have a word? Rebecca paused, surprised by the direct approach. Of course, Mrs. Peterson. How is your husband recovering? Much improved, thanks to your medicine. Mrs. Peterson twisted her hands nervously. That's why I wanted to speak with you. The other miners' wives and I, well, we've been talking about how we treated you, about the rumors. Rebecca maintained her composure, though her heart beat faster. That's not necessary, Mrs. Peterson. I understand how communities function. It may not be necessary, but it's right, the woman insisted with unexpected firmness. We judged without knowing, whispered without understanding. She took a deep breath. I wanted to say we're sorry, and to ask if you might be willing to teach some of us about your remedies, not just for the mining sickness, but for other ailments, too. The request, simple but profound, represented everything Rebecca had hoped for but never expected. Not just tolerance, but active engagement. Not just acceptance, but respect for her knowledge. I would be honored, she replied carefully, not wanting her emotion to overwhelm her response. Perhaps we could arrange weekly gatherings to share knowledge. Mrs. Peterson's face brightened. That would be wonderful. I'll speak with the others. She hesitated before adding, and Mrs. Harlow, thank you for helping our men despite how we treated you. That says more about your character than any rumor ever could. As the woman hurried away, Rebecca stood momentarily still, absorbing the significance of what had just occurred. The shift in community perception wasn't just about her remedies proving effective. It was about people recognizing their own role in perpetuating injustice through gossip and exclusion. At her cabin, Rebecca found Sullivan waiting, his tall figure almost incongruous against the small porch. He stepped aside as she approached, explaining his presence with typical economy. Checking on your supply needs. Miners volunteered to gather herbs if you provide locations. The offer touched her deeply. That's very kind. I could certainly use help collecting yarrow and wild cherry bark. Sullivan produced a small map from his pocket, unfolding it carefully. Mark the best gathering locations. I'll organize collection. Parties. As Rebecca indicated prime spots for medicinal herbs around Pinewood Valley, she was struck by how naturally Sullivan had assumed a coordinating role despite his preference for solitude. The crisis had revealed unexpected depths to his character, not just self-sufficiency, but a profound sense of community responsibility hidden beneath his taciturn exterior. "You've become quite the community organizer, Mr. Sullivan," she observed. "Quite a change from your solitary life on the ridge." Sullivan considered this observation with characteristic thoughtfulness. "Temporary necessity," he repeated his earlier assessment, then added more quietly, "though some changes may last." The simple statement from a man so economical with words carried significant weight. Rebecca understood he wasn't just referring to mining safety measures. "I hope some do," she replied with equal simplicity. Their exchange was interrupted by Dr. Hayes's arrival, his expression both troubled and determined. "2 more cases identified. At the crushing facility," he reported without preamble. "Early stages, thankfully. I've ordered operations suspended until proper ventilation can be installed." Sullivan nodded, unsurprised. "Expected as much. Rock dust spreads easily. Blackwood will be displeased about the additional disruption," Rebecca observed. Hayes shrugged, a hint of defiance in his normally diplomatic demeanor. "Blackwood's displeasure means less to me than preventing further illness. My medical obligation is clear." His stance represented another shift in Pinewood's power dynamics. Hayes had always been respected as the town physician, but his deference to mining company priorities had been equally well established. Now, medical necessity and human welfare had clearly taken precedence in his decision-making. "We'll need to check mining families too," Rebecca suggested. "Dust could travel home on clothing, potentially exposing women and children." Hayes nodded grimly. "Excellent point. I'll arrange examinations immediately." They spent the remainder of the day in coordinated action, checking potential exposure points, examining workers and family members, implementing safety measures, and administering treatments to those already affected. By evening, a comprehensive response had taken shape, with responsibilities distributed among those best suited to handle them. As darkness fell, Rebecca found herself back at her cabin, exhausted but fulfilled in a way she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. The day's events had transformed her role in Pinewood from outcast to essential contributor, her knowledge no longer dismissed but actively sought. A gentle knock at her door revealed Sullivan once again, this time carrying a basket covered with a clean cloth. "Community offering," he explained, setting it on her table. "Food from miners' wives, gratitude for your help." Rebecca uncovered the basket to find an assortment of home-cooked meals, bread still warm from the oven, preserved fruits, a container of stew, even a small cake. More than the practical assistance, the gesture represented acceptance, appreciation, community. "This is unexpected," she managed, emotion making her voice slightly unsteady. Sullivan watched her reaction with quiet understanding. People remember kindness shown when they needed it most, especially kindness they didn't deserve. The insight was profound from a man of so few words. Rebecca wondered yet again about the experiences that had shaped Sullivan's worldview, his preference for solitude, coupled with his innate understanding of human nature. "Will you stay for supper?" she asked impulsively. "There's certainly plenty." Sullivan hesitated, clearly torn between his habitual isolation and the simple human connection being offered. "Brief meal," he finally agreed. "Need to check ventilation adjustments afterward." They shared a simple but comfortable meal, their conversation sparse but meaningful. Sullivan spoke little of his past, beyond practical details of his mining experience. Yet Rebecca sensed depths beneath his reticence, not secretiveness, but a natural privacy she respected. As he prepared to leave, Sullivan paused at the door. "Town meeting tomorrow, mining company called it, discussing ongoing safety measures." "Has Blackwood changed his position?" Rebecca asked, surprised by this development. "Adapting to reality," Sullivan repeated his earlier assessment. Denver office involved now, concerned about liability. The news confirmed Hayes's prediction that the company would ultimately prioritize its reputation over short-term production. "Will you attend the meeting?" Sullivan nodded. "Need to ensure ventilation requirements aren't minimized. Hayes will address medical protocols." He hesitated before adding, "Your presence would be valuable. Knowledge of treatments, symptoms." The invitation, implied rather than stated directly, represented another step toward formal recognition of her role in addressing the crisis. "I'll be there," Rebecca promised. After Sullivan departed, Rebecca stood in her doorway for a long moment, watching his tall figure disappear into the darkness. The day had brought more changes than she could fully process, from Martha Winters seeking her help to Mrs. Peterson's apology, from the basket of food to Sullivan's continuing evolution from hermit to community advocate. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, particularly at the town meeting where opposing interests would clash over long-term solutions. But for tonight, Rebecca allowed herself to feel the simple satisfaction of having her worth recognized, her knowledge respected, her place in the community beginning to take shape not as the whispered-about widow, but as a healer whose contributions mattered. The transition from damaged goods to valued neighbor had begun, not through dramatic declarations or confrontations, but through the quiet effectiveness of knowledge applied with compassion, regardless of how it had initially been received. Some in Pinewood might never fully accept her, but the foundations for a new understanding had been laid, stone by stone, truth by truth, healing by healing. As she prepared for sleep, Rebecca felt something she had almost forgotten, a sense of belonging, tentative but growing stronger with each person who chose to see her for who she truly was, rather than who rumor had painted her to be. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight that growing sense of connection was enough. The town hall had never been so crowded. Miners and their families packed the wooden benches, while shopkeepers and other Pinewood residents stood along the walls, their expressions ranging from concerned to curious. Rebecca hesitated at the entrance, surprised by the turnout. A town meeting about mine safety would normally attract only those directly involved, yet it seemed the entire community had assembled. Dr. Hayes appeared at her side, equally impressed by the attendance. Word travels quickly in Pinewood. What began as a mining issue has clearly become a community concern. Rebecca nodded, scanning the crowd for Sullivan. She spotted him at the back of the room, standing with characteristic stillness against the wall. Unlike his usual solitary positioning, miners clustered near him, occasionally leaning in to catch his sparse but evidently valued comments. "Shall we?" Hayes gestured toward two empty seats near the front, reserved for them by Quinn, who now waved them forward. Rebecca felt the weight of eyes upon her as she made her way through the crowd. Unlike previous public gatherings, where whispers and averted gazes had followed her, she now received acknowledging nods, even a few murmured thanks from miners' wives. The shift was subtle but unmistakable, from object of suspicion to person of value. Edward Blackwood stood at the front of the room beside Mayor Thompson, examining some documents with apparent displeasure. When he noticed Rebecca and Hayes approaching, his expression hardened momentarily before resuming its professional mask. "Quite the audience," Mayor Thompson observed nervously. A shopkeeper by trade, the mayor typically deferred to mining company interests, recognizing that Pinewood's economic survival depended on silver production. "Indeed," Hayes replied evenly. "The arsenoperite issue affects more than just the miners. Young William Winters' illness demonstrated that." The mention of the boy seemed to unsettle the mayor further. "Yes, terrible business. Mrs. Winters tells me he's improving, thankfully." He lowered his voice. "I understand Mrs. Harlow's remedies played a role in that improvement." Rebecca inclined her head slightly, neither confirming nor denying the implicit question. Let her work speak for itself. Mayor Thompson cleared his throat and called the meeting to order. The buzz of conversation faded as he explained the purpose: to address the health concerns related to the Western Tunnel and establish community-wide safety protocols. Mr. Blackwood has graciously agreed to outline the mining company's response to these concerns, the mayor announced, yielding the floor with visible relief. Blackwood stepped forward, adopting the confident posture of a man accustomed to controlling the narrative. Citizens of Pinewood, the Silver Ridge Mining Company has always prioritized the safety and welfare of our employees and the community we serve. A subtle shifting among the miners suggested this claim wasn't universally accepted, but no one interrupted. Recent health incidents connected to a particular mineral formation in the Western Tunnel have been addressed promptly and thoroughly, Blackwood continued. Under Dr. Hayes's medical guidance, we've implemented enhanced ventilation, protective equipment, and adjusted work schedules to minimize exposure risks. His careful phrasing, attributing all solutions to Hayes while omitting any mention of Rebecca or Sullivan, was deliberate and strategic. Hayes noticed it too, judging by his slight frown. Additionally, we've suspended operations at the assay and crushing facilities pending installation of improved safety measures. These actions demonstrate our commitment to addressing this situation responsibly and effectively. Blackwood paused, surveying the room. While these measures have temporarily reduced production, we believe protecting our workforce is paramount. The company expects to resume normal operations within 2 weeks, with all safety protocols firmly established. Quinn stirred beside Rebecca. 2 weeks, he muttered. We haven't even fully identified all exposure points yet. Blackwood concluded with practiced assurance. Dr. Hayes will continue monitoring the situation, with the company providing all necessary resources for treatment and prevention. We appreciate the community's patience during this temporary adjustment period. His deliberate omission of Rebecca's role in treatment and Sullivan's contributions to safety improvements did not go unnoticed, nor did his characterization of the crisis as essentially resolved, a temporary adjustment rather than an ongoing safety concern requiring permanent changes. Mayor Thompson reclaimed the floor, clearly hoping to maintain the meeting's conciliatory tone. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Dr. Hayes, would you care to address the medical aspects of the situation? Hayes rose, straightening his waistcoat with the precise movements that characterized his professional demeanor. Thank you, Mayor. First, I must correct several significant omissions in Mr. Blackwood's assessment. Blackwood's expression tightened. Perceptibly, the health crisis we're facing is arsenopyrite poisoning, a serious and potentially fatal condition caused by exposure to arsenic released when certain mineral formations are disturbed. While the company has indeed implemented some recommended safety measures, these represent only partial compliance with necessary protocols. Hayes's direct challenge to Blackwood's narrative caused a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. Vice, Doctor continued undeterred. Furthermore, the successful treatment of affected individuals has been largely due to the expertise and remedies provided by Mrs. Rebecca Harlow, whose knowledge of arsenopyrite poisoning proved invaluable when conventional treatments failed. Rebecca felt a rush of gratitude for Hayes's public acknowledgement, unexpected despite their growing professional respect. Finally, the safety improvements at the mine itself owe much to Mr. Nathaniel Sullivan's practical experience with similar situations in Montana mines. His technical knowledge of proper ventilation and containment methods has been essential to protecting miners from further exposure. Heads turned towards Sullivan, who accepted the attention with characteristic stoicism, his expression unchanged. Hayes turned to address Blackwood directly. 2 weeks is insufficient for establishing the effectiveness of our protective measures. I recommend a minimum of 1 month of closely monitored operations before considering a return to full production schedules. Blackwood's face had flushed with barely controlled anger. The company has already been exceedingly generous in accommodating these disruptions, Doctor. Extended delays threaten not just profits, but the very viability of the operation and, by extension, this entire community. The implied threat hung in the air, familiar to anyone in a mining town. Companies could and did abandon operations when profitability faltered, leaving communities to wither and die. To everyone's surprise, it was Thomas Winters who rose to speak next. The assay office manager had been notably quiet about his son's illness until now. "Mr. Blackwood," he began, his voice steady despite his evident discomfort with public speaking. "My boy nearly died because none of us recognized the danger in those rock samples. If Mrs. Harlow hadn't identified the cause and provided treatment..." He paused, emotion briefly overtaking him. William is improving now, but he was as blue as a summer sky when Dr. Hayes arrived. The personal testimony from a respected town resident rather than a miner shifted the room's atmosphere perceptibly. "I understand production concerns," Winters continued. "The assay office answers to the same quotas and schedules. But I watched my son struggle for each breath, and I'd trade every ounce of silver in that mountain before I'd risk another child suffering the same." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Blackwood's expression remained fixed, but Rebecca noted a calculating assessment in his eyes as he measured the room's changing sentiment. Mayor Thompson attempted to regain control of the increasingly contentious meeting. Perhaps Mrs. Harlow might share her perspective on the treatment progress. That could help inform decisions about appropriate timelines. Rebecca rose, conscious of the attention suddenly focused on her. For 2 years, she had been the subject of whispers and averted gazes. Now, an entire community awaited her words with expectant silence. "Arsenopyrite poisoning affects individuals differently, depending on exposure levels and duration," she began, her voice growing stronger as she focused on sharing her knowledge rather than dwelling on the strangeness of her changed position. "Those already ill are indeed improving with treatment, but recovery is gradual. The poison accumulates in the body over time and requires both proper treatment and prevention of further exposure to ensure complete recovery." She turned slightly toward Blackwood, maintaining professional composure despite her fundamental disagreement with his approach. "Resuming full operations prematurely risks not only new cases, but potential relapse in those currently recovering. The western tunnel's arsenopyrite concentration appears particularly high, requiring more robust protective measures than have been implemented thus far." Quinn nodded vigorously, clearly appreciating the scientific support for his operational concerns. Several miners called out their agreement, their voices carrying the authority of first-hand experience with the illness. Blackwood stepped forward again, his strategic mind visibly recalculating as public opinion shifted against his preferred timeline. "The company certainly values community health above all else," he conceded with practiced sincerity. "However, practical considerations must also be addressed. Extended shutdowns have ripple effects, supply contracts unfulfilled, investor confidence undermined, wages reduced." It was Sullivan who responded, his quiet voice somehow cutting through the rising tension without being raised. "Montana mine faced similar choice, rushed reopening. 3 more deaths, company lost more than just production time." The simple statement, from a man known for his reticence, carried particular weight. Sullivan rarely spoke publicly, making his words all the more impactful when he chose to share them. "Proper implementation prevents that outcome," he continued, addressing the practical concern at the heart of Blackwood's resistance. "Not about stopping work, about doing it safely." Rebecca watched Sullivan with growing appreciation. His contribution wasn't emotional appeal or scientific explanation. He offered the practical middle ground that acknowledged both safety and production needs. His approach opened a path forward that Blackwood would find difficult to dismiss, without appearing unreasonable. Mayor Thompson seized the opportunity. Perhaps a compromise is possible. Dr. Hayes, Mrs. Harlow, Mr. Sullivan, could you work with Mr. Blackwood to develop a graduated approach? Limited operations with enhanced protections, expanding as safety is confirmed. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. A reasonable suggestion. Monitored, phased resumption with comprehensive health checks and mandatory protective protocols. Blackwood recognized the shift in room sentiment and adapted accordingly. The company is always willing to consider practical approaches that balance safety and operational needs. A graduated resumption might indeed address both concerns. His capitulation, strategic, rather than heartfelt, nonetheless represented progress. Rebecca exchanged glances with Hayes, both recognizing that Blackwood was yielding to public pressure rather than genuine conviction. Still, results mattered more than motivations in this instance. Mayor Thompson, relieved to have steered the meeting toward consensus, quickly established a committee to develop the graduated reopening plan. Hayes, Sullivan, Quinn, and Blackwood, with Rebecca serving as medical advisor, a title Blackwood grudgingly accepted after Hayes insisted. As the meeting concluded, Rebecca found herself surrounded by community members seeking advice about symptoms, treatment questions, and preventative measures. The scene was surreal after years of isolation. Miners' wives, who had previously crossed the street to avoid her, now asked detailed questions about protecting their families from residual exposure. Mrs. Harlow, Martha Winters approached, her usual social confidence subdued. William has been asking for you. He says your medicine tastes terrible, but works better than anything the doctor gave him. She smiled slightly. He has his father's bluntness, I'm afraid. Children often make the most honest patients, Rebecca replied warmly. I'm glad he's improving. Martha hesitated before continuing. I wondered if you might visit him tomorrow. He has questions about the herbs you use. Seems quite fascinated by the whole process. The invitation to enter the Winters home as a welcome guest, rather than a barely tolerated necessity, represented another shift in Pinewood's social reconfiguration. I'd be happy to visit, perhaps around noon. Perfect. And Martha lowered her voice slightly. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Harlow. I've been unkind in ways that reflect poorly on my character, not yours. Rebecca could have pointed out that unkind scarcely captured years of active rumor spreading and social ostracism. Instead, she simply nodded acceptance. We all do what makes sense, given what we believe to be true at the time, Mrs. Winters. Martha seemed both grateful for the gracious response and uncomfortably aware that she didn't particularly deserve it. With a murmured thanks, she rejoined her husband, who nodded respectfully to Rebecca from across the room. Hayes approached as the crowd gradually dispersed. Well done, Mrs. Harlow. Your medical assessment was precisely what was needed. Factual, clear, and difficult for even Blackwood to dismiss. Sullivan's practical perspective was equally valuable, Rebecca observed, glancing toward the back of the room where the taciturn man was quietly explaining something to Quinn, his hands sketching what appeared to be ventilation schematics in the air. Indeed, our unlikely trio seems to complement each other rather effectively. Hayes adjusted his spectacles thoughtfully. Speaking of which, Blackwood has requested we meet tomorrow morning to begin drafting the graduated reopening. In plan, 9 o'clock at the company office. Rebecca nodded, recognizing that their victory remained partial and precarious. I'll bring my documentation on recovery progression and relapse indicators. Those will be essential for establishing appropriate monitoring protocols. As Hayes departed to speak with Mayor Thompson, Rebecca found herself momentarily alone, observing the shifting social dynamics around her. For 2 years, she had existed at Pinewood's margins, present but not participant. Now she stood somewhere different, not fully embraced perhaps, but undeniably valued. Quite a change. Sullivan had approached with his characteristic silent movement, suddenly beside her without announcement. Community perspectives shift when necessity outweighs prejudice. Rebecca smiled slightly at his perceptiveness. Necessity is certainly a powerful motivator, though I wonder how lasting such shifts prove once the crisis passes. Sullivan considered this with his usual thoughtfulness. Some return to old patterns, comfortable assumptions. Others, remember, depends on whether they value truth over convenience. His simple assessment captured the essential nature of community transformation. Never universal, never complete, but significant nonetheless when enough individuals chose to sustain it. Will you continue your involvement once the safety protocols are established? Rebecca asked, curious about Sullivan's plans now that his self-imposed isolation had been so thoroughly disrupted. Until properly implemented, he confirmed. Need to ensure ventilation systems maintained correctly. Show miners how to identify dangerous formations. He paused before adding, then back to ridge, mostly. The qualification, that single word, mostly, suggested a subtle but significant adjustment to his habitual solitude. Rebecca wondered if it represented the same kind of recalibration she was experiencing, not a complete transformation, but a meaningful shift in boundaries and connections. The committee will benefit from your practical knowledge, she offered, as will the miners. Sullivan nodded once, then glanced toward the door where several miners were waiting, clearly hoping to speak with him about specific safety questions. Need to address their concerns. Plans for tomorrow's meeting? 9 o'clock. I'll bring recovery documentation. We'll arrive early. Check Blackwood's ventilation diagrams before meeting. Ensure accuracy. With that pragmatic statement, Sullivan moved toward the waiting miners, his commitment to thorough implementation evident in every aspect of his approach. Rebecca gathered her materials, preparing to return to her cabin and organize the documentation needed for tomorrow's meeting. As she stepped outside, the evening air carried the first hint of autumn crispness. Pinewood spread before her, its buildings glowing warm against the gathering dusk, the mine visible as a dark shape against the mountainside. Martin Pearson, one of the first miners to fall ill, approached as she descended the town hall steps. His breathing had improved considerably, under treatment, though his complexion still carried the pallor of recent illness. Mrs. Harlow, he greeted her, touching his cap respectfully, wanted to thank you proper. The missus says I'd be underground now, if not for your medicines. I'm glad you're recovering, Mr. Pearson. Are you continuing the tincture 3 times daily? Yes, ma'am. Tastes like swamp water, begging your pardon, but works better than anything I've tried. He hesitated before continuing. Some of us miners were talking. Thought maybe we could help with your garden come spring. Expand it some, build proper beds. Seems only right, considering. The offer, simple, practical, and genuinely thoughtful, touched Rebecca deeply. That would be most appreciated, Mr. Pearson. The additional space would allow for growing more of the herbs needed for treating various ailments. Pearson nodded, satisfied. Good. We'll plan on it then. Maybe get started with the preparations. Before snow flies. With another respectful touch to his cap, he continued down the street toward home. Rebecca watched him go, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time. From whispers of damaged goods to offers of garden expansion, the transformation seemed almost unbelievable. Yet she harbored no illusions about its completeness or permanence. Some in Pinewood would likely never fully accept her. Their suspicions, too deeply entrenched to be entirely dislodged by mere evidence of her value. What mattered was that enough had changed to create space for her to contribute, to use her knowledge for the community's benefit, to exist as more than just the subject of rumors. It wasn't perfect acceptance, but it was a path forward that held meaning and purpose. The walk to her cabin gave Rebecca time to reflect on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 2 years of isolation following Thomas's death had been painful, yet they had also strengthened her self-reliance and clarified her values. She had continued her healing work privately, maintaining her grandmother's traditions despite community rejection. That persistence now served not just her, but the entire town. Her cabin appeared ahead, its simple silhouette outlined against the deepening twilight. For the first time since Thomas's death, it struck her not as a place of exile, but as a home. Modest, but purposeful, like the life she was gradually rebuilding. A figure waited on her porch, tall and unmistakable, even in the gathering darkness. Sullivan stood as she approached, something held carefully in his hands. "Evening delivery," he explained, extending a small wooden box. "Miners found more samples, different formations. Thought you might want to test them." Rebecca accepted. The box, recognizing the thoughtfulness behind the simple gesture. Sullivan had noted her scientific interest in the arsenopyrite and recognized her capability to contribute to ongoing identification efforts. "Thank you. I'll examine them carefully," Sullivan nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the last colors of sunset were fading. "Meeting with Blackwood tomorrow. Be prepared for resistance to extended timelines." Hayes and I have been documenting recovery patterns. The evidence supports a cautious, graduated approach. Evidence helps. Blackwood respects liability concerns more than medical recommendations. Sullivan's pragmatic assessment echoed Rebecca's own thoughts. Community opinion shifting helps too. Harder to dismiss safety when town watching closely. Rebecca smiled slightly at his strategic thinking. "You understand power dynamics rather well for someone who avoids town politics." Something almost like amusement flickered in Sullivan's expression. "Observation requires less participation than you might think." The simple statement revealed much about his approach to life. Present but detached, aware but uninvolved. Until now, when circumstance had pulled him into direct engagement with community concerns that aligned with his own values. "Will you return completely to your solitude once this is resolved?" Rebecca asked, genuinely curious about his intentions. Sullivan considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Patterns change gradually. Solitude remains preferable. Community connections have value too. He gestured vaguely toward town. "Balance adjusts." His answer, though characteristically economical, confirmed Rebecca's earlier impression of a man gradually recalibrating his boundaries rather than maintaining rigid isolation. She found herself hoping that this recalibration might include continued connections with Pinewood, and perhaps with her specifically, though she hesitated to examine that hope too closely. "Balance is important," she agreed. "Finding where we truly belong often means creating that place rather than simply discovering it." Sullivan studied her with unexpected intensity, as if her observation had articulated something he had felt but not named. "Creating belonging. Yes." After a moment he added, "You've done that here, despite resistance." The simple acknowledgement of her resilience meant more coming from Sullivan than elaborate praise would have from others. He was a man who measured words carefully, making those he chose to share particularly valuable. "As have you in your own way," Rebecca replied. "Your mountain solitude is as much a creation as a discovery, I suspect." Sullivan nodded once, accepting the insight. "Tomorrow's meeting. Need to prepare?" Yes, I should organize my documentation. 9 o'clock comes early. With a brief nod of farewell, Sullivan stepped off the porch and headed toward the forest path that would take him back to his ridge dwelling. Rebecca watched until his tall figure disappeared into the gathering darkness, then entered her cabin with the box of mineral samples. Inside, she lit the lamps and surveyed the small space that had been both refuge and prison during her years of social exile. Herbs hung from the rafters, journals lined the shelves, remedies in various stages of preparation occupied the workable. It was a healer's space, practical and purposeful. Tomorrow, it would become something more, the working area of Pinewoods. Recognized medical advisor, a title that acknowledged what she had been all along despite community denial. Rebecca opened Sullivan's box, carefully examining the mineral specimens within. They varied in composition, some clearly containing arsenopyrite while others appeared to be unrelated formations. She appreciated the thoroughness of the collection. Sullivan had ensured she received samples representing the full range of minerals miners might encounter, not just those already known to be dangerous. As she sorted and labeled the specimens, Rebecca reflected on the unexpected allies this crisis had brought her. Hayes, with his gradual shift from professional skepticism to respectful collaboration. Quinn, whose initial hostility had transformed into pragmatic appreciation for her knowledge. The miners and their families, who now sought her care after years of avoidance. And Sullivan, the most unexpected ally of all, a man who valued isolation as she had been forced to endure it, who recognized knowledge regardless of its source, who spoke rarely but acted decisively when matters of truth and safety were at stake. Morning would bring a new challenge in the form of Blackwood's resistance to comprehensive safety measures. The mining company representative would undoubtedly attempt to minimize requirements and accelerate the return to full production. Yet Rebecca felt a quiet confidence in the committee's ability to maintain focus on necessary protections. Between Hayes's medical authority, Sullivan's practical expertise, and her own documented evidence, they formed a formidable coalition for truth. Rebecca completed her preparations for the morning meeting, organizing recovery documentation and treatment protocols into clear, undeniable evidence. As she prepared for sleep, her thoughts returned to the community gathering at Town Hall. Faces that had once turned away now turned toward her with respect. Voices that had whispered now spoke directly with gratitude. The transition wasn't complete, might never be absolute. Some wounds heal slowly, and communities, like individuals, change in gradual, uneven ways. Yet something fundamental had shifted, not just in how Pinewood viewed her, but in how she viewed herself. No longer defined primarily by loss and exclusion, she had reclaimed her identity as a healer, a contributor, a person of value. What others had dismissed as damaged goods had proven to be essential knowledge at a critical moment. The labels applied by others had never defined her true worth. They had merely revealed the limitations of those who used them. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but Rebecca would meet them as she now was. Not the whispered about widow, but a woman whose knowledge saved lives, whose resilience outlasted rejection, whose worth had finally found recognition, not despite the community's judgment, but because reality had finally outweighed rumor. Outside her window, stars brightened against the deepening night. Somewhere on the ridge, Sullivan would be preparing for tomorrow's confrontation in his own methodical way. Hayes would be updating his medical documentation in town. Miners would be discussing the day's developments in their homes, sharing stories of illness and recovery, of poison rock and healing remedies, of the woman they had dismissed who now helped save their lives. The story Pinewood told itself was changing, word by word, day by day, and Rebecca's place within that story had fundamentally transformed, from cautionary tale to testament of resilience, from object of suspicion to source of healing. As she drifted towards sleep, Rebecca felt a sense of peace that had eluded her since Thomas's death. Her path forward would not be without obstacles, but it now led through the community rather than around its edges. Not complete acceptance, perhaps, but genuine belonging, created rather than merely discovered, as she had observed to Sullivan. That belonging, hard-won through knowledge applied with compassion despite rejection, represented something far more valuable than the easy acceptance of those who had never questioned her worth. It was built on foundation of truth rather than convenience, of substance rather than appearance. In the end, what mattered wasn't erasing the damaged goods label completely from every mind in Pinewood. What mattered was recognizing it had never accurately described her to begin with, and finding those, like Hayes and Sullivan, who saw beyond labels to the person and knowledge beneath. Tomorrow would come with its own challenges. For tonight, the knowledge that truth had begun to outweigh rumor was enough. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.